Mist rose in threads from the canal and clung to the pilings like old cobweb. Boats nudged one another, soft as beasts in a winter stable, and the bells of Bravos spoke through fog. Thin accordant iron that would never sound the same again once you learned to hear the breath beneath the metal. She listened, barefaced in the morning, the only time she allowed her skin to be itself in open air, and counted the boats by their wakes. A gondola's wake lay in a single cut, tidy as a knife through cloth. Traders from Pentos left a soft triangle. The fat-bellied barges made long, flapping scars and whispered the day's work. Sugar, wine, plankwood, and beyond it all, like a mountain murmuring in its sleep, the Titan groaned where the ocean curled around his feet. She had sold mussels here and run fast as an alley cat under gulls and the long noontide glare. She had sung to a dead god in a hall of faces, and in that cool quiet, she had felt the world's breath passing through 100 skins. She had worn some of them. She knew the weight of another woman's mouth when a lie needed to be sweet, the ache of another man's knees when the road had to be trudged like punishment. There were days when she thought she might indeed unmake herself into clean emptiness. There were nights when something inside her looked up from a dark riverbank and refused. The kindly man had said the river could take stones you did not need. He had taught her to hold a stone in her mouth until her tongue forgot it. He was not wrong. There were names she no longer spoke when sleep turned her loose into the old corridors of Winterfell. Names that had once seethed hot on her lips, like iron in snow. Others returned when she thought she had misplaced them. She kept all of it locked where no one's hand could reach. That morning, she skirted the market and went to the house of black and white, by a path that kept her from seeing herself in the canals. The house watched the water with blind windows, white and black, a doctrine of opposites spelled into stone. She knew the pattern of mold on its lintel. She knew the lentil bitter taste that waited behind the doors, and the hush inside that was not silence, but a living absence into which footsteps fell and were swallowed. She took the drip of candlelight down the hall, past bowls shaped like open palms, past statues whose mouths never moved, though she had seen them speak in her dreams. When she reached the chamber where the walls hung with faces, she paused long enough to let her breath steady. The faces did not look back at her. They looked inward, remembering everything like water remembers its shape, even when ice steals it. The kindly man was waiting in a smaller room, where the floor held a shallow bowl of water and a single reed lay across it. The reed half sank, half floated, neither willing to drown nor burden enough to lay itself wholly on the surface. "You come with your skin today," he said, and his smile made lines like crow's feet around eyes that had been many and none. She had discarded 2 faces in favor of her own that dawn. She had felt the pores of her true cheeks open to the fog, and had known without wanting it that she would say what she had not come there to say. A coin has no face until it is stamped. She answered. It was the sort of reply he liked, crisp, almost pious in its humility. She did not pretend her heart was as humble as her words. "The coin is soft before it is stamped," he said. He dipped a finger into the bowl, and the reed drifted an inch and balanced again. A girl wishes for a stamping? The way he said a girl was a courtesy now, not commandment. She had earned enough to hear her old name breathe under those words sometimes. He never spoke it. If he did, she thought, she might run. "I have done your work," she said. "I have learned your faces. I have given the gift where it was asked. I have learned hunger and ignorance, and how to move them from one man to another, with the grace of a hand changing knives. And yet," he said softly, "you come with your skin. Some faces cling," she said. "Some are stitched where the seam won't give." He let that be true. And the stamping. She had not rehearsed the words, but they had gathered themselves in her long before she was brave enough to hear them. "Once I thought I came here to be no one. Then I thought I came to learn how to make no one of anyone. Now I think the truer craft is not unmaking, but choosing. Who sits? Who goes? Which life is cut short, so that a better one can be long. I cannot swear that this is the many-faced God's truth, but I know it in my bones, like I know the shape of my hand." She looked at the reed. The room smelled of water tasted 100 times. I am not asking to be forgiven for wanting. I am asking to be taught how to want cleanly. His eyes closed and opened with the slow patience of a winter tree. Many seek to make kings, he said. Few wish to pay the price. Fewer know the price when they reach for the purse. Menmawan. I wish to make a queen, she said. Saying it aloud was like stepping on frozen river and feeling it hold, the world wider beneath her. Not for myself. We do not choose for ourselves, he said mildly. We are the god's fingers. The god has many arms. She said, one reaches north. A longer quiet took him then. He studied the hanging faces as if they might supply a precedent. We do not traffic in crowns, he said at last. We traffic in balances. A coin that does not ring true is struck again. A life that does not bear its own weight ends. But some balances are larger than our bowls. The sea balances itself with storms no man orders. To think you will make a queen is presumptuous. I do not think I will make her, she said. I think I will set the table so that when she sits, the chair will not break. He looked at her, and in his gaze she felt the reach of a dozen cities where he had taught a dozen children how to lay down their old names. And who would you have sit? His tone made no mockery of the question. Yet he had turned the reed with his finger, and it sank a little before recovering. She is stark, Arya said. The name warped the air. She had not said it in this room for months. She held herself steady and did not apologize to the god. She was born to snow and root and stone. She will not be the queen of all. I know the north and the north knows itself. Let her be that queen. Let the north's long wound be bound. So that, let, he repeated. You say let as if the world were a horse that would lower its head to your bridle. She will not need a bridle, Arya said. She needs a wall around the chair. She needs men to remember what oaths sound like when they are spoken under a heart tree. She needs her enemies to speak too loudly to one another until their voices drown them. You were not taught to steal lives for your own debts, he said. You were taught to give the gift for the gods. Then teach me to make those who have stolen pay theirs. She answered, I cannot empty myself and pretend the river did it. I cannot say that there is no girl from the north who learned her numbers in a counting hall. She is in me, and I am her, and we both have debts. The god does not only take, the god balances. Ben? The kindly man reached down and lifted the reed with 2 fingers, shook it free of water, and lay it again. It held. If you go north as what you are, he said, you will be broken. Not by a knife, by duty. A blade that bends but does not break grows thin. A thin blade snaps in winter and does not warn you except by a song you don't hear until after. Dan. His words made a hollow behind her ribs that she recognized. It was the same space where the list had once lived. Tell me how not to break, she said. You must carry the god with you inside your wanting, he said. You must ask no man to die who would not owe his death to a god you could name to his widow. You must remember that a queen made from knives sits on knives. The longer she sits, the better her blood learns the taste of steel. I would rather her blood learn steel than mud, Arya said. There has been enough mud. He nodded as if someone had reported the weather. There is a place in the north where your old gods keep a listening bowl. He gestured toward the water. If you can find it and kneel there without your heart cracking like last winter's ice, I will call what you ask a service. You will not choose life for your queen. You will choose deaths for her. We will call those who must pay, and the god will lend you faces to collect from those very mouths. But you will not decide that her sister or her favorite dog needs a winter sleep. If we learn you have cut for convenience, we will cut you. Do you know this price? Then shall. I do, she said. She heard herself, and the voice was steady. And I know where that bowl is. I doubt that, he said. but I doubt many things that prove true. Bring me a word when you have found it." She bent in gratitude. She expected him to send her to prepare in the cellar where the stone was newer, and the air tasted of ash and salt. Instead, he held up a hand. "Leave your knives, not the one you think of as yourself. The others." She set them down. Each hilt meant another woman's fingers. When she left the room, she felt less armed and more honest. And she did not like the sensation. It was not weakness, but she had lived by the kind of power that comes from the knowledge of how a wrist turns. Out in the morning again, she was plain-faced and plain-clothed. She went to the dock by the singing tower and bought silence in the captain's cabin with the coin, whose face changed whenever she stilled her mind to look at it. Her passage cost a fiction and a prayer. The fiction took her father's surname and gave it to a dead man from White Harbor whose sons were out at sea. The prayer was an old one, and it tasted like pine needles under snow. The sea's mood was the sea's and cared little for names. She kept to herself, working where it kept her hands honest, coiling lines, scouring the deck, hauling nets when the captain asked. She chose a face for one night only, a fisherman's widow from the Fingers, so she could speak a few necessary lies about who might meet her when they reached White Harbor. The next day, she let that woman go and stood at the rail with her own mouth again. The salt picked at her lips, and the wind took her hair like an old aunt fussing at the untidy child of a house. She watched the Titan as long as it stayed in sight, its shadow swallowing and then releasing waves that would have been waves without it. She thought of Winterfell's godswood, of the careful arithmetic of old oaths. Arithmetic had become a church to her. Not numbers, not sums, but the feeling of equality when you made a thing line up with itself. The sea gave way to a mouth of river and the marsh steam smell of the Mander. The welcoming banners of White Harbor were clean and certain against the dull sky. And though she had no right to any of it, the sight of the long white stone caught her in the throat. The city wore winter with dignity. Fishwives had their wool pulled tight, and children ran as if they had been told to run and had taken it on as a vocation. The pier calls used different words but meant the same as bravos, news, price, hunger, hope. Men in green and gray spoke to men in warm browns. There were fewer blues than she remembered from the warm months. She felt the city take her measure and pass her by without remark. That was good. She wanted to be nothing here but a woman with a bag and a hunger for bread dipped in drippings. She bought the bread from a man with a scar like a soft thumbprint on his temple. He thanked her with a look that said he had once been finer, and she gave him a coin that would feel richer when he counted it later. Sometimes kindness was as exact as murder. You still had to choose the angle. She found the dockside singers easily. In every city, a handful of those who make sound for their supper circle the same corners as if a map had been drawn in air before any stone was laid. She paid for a song she did not listen to and asked a question she did not need answered. Which carter would go north with salted cod and ferry a quiet woman who could mend a harness? The carter had 4 fingers on his right hand and a smile that had learned its lesson the hard way. He took her, and he did not ask what she carried besides the small bundle at her back. It pleased her that she had to remind herself what was in that bundle. A face or two, a length of wire, axe, dot, a bit of ink tucked in a twist of cloth. All tools, none of them more sacred than a spool of thread, until she told them what to be. They left the city of the wolf just before evening and slept one night in a byre that smelled of the old cows who had made the place worth anything. The road past the barrow spoke in low voices, even when no one else was on it. There were stones here that knew her and didn't say so, and that was the North's first welcome. She slept with her hand on the thin knife the kindly man had told her not to bring. She had left the others. This one had survived her obedience. The days pulled them along. The carter's mare had the good sense of beasts who have never been given a foolish command. Flocks of birds turned like coins flipping mid-air. The sky was the color of old pewter on most days, and polished pewter when the sun found the patience to lean through. She made herself say the names of the mile markers, not in the tongue she had used in Bravos, but in the language the snow used when it sifted into the folds of a cloak. She had missed that language so much. She had mistaken the ache for hunger, or anger, or loneliness. It was none of these in all of them. They came at last to Winterfell, which did not know it was lasting. Smoke rose from within its walls. She counted the guards with her eyes, and with the place in her ribs that could now keep numbers like a banker. The banners were wrong. They would not always be wrong. She said that not with the arrogance of a prayer, but with the bone confidence of a girl who remembered how her mother's hand felt when it pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. The carter parted ways with her under the pretense that she had a cousin among the washerwomen. She had never been cousin to a washerwoman, but she knew how to make a cousin from 2 honest hours of scrub and silence. She went in by a side gate in a face that would not be remembered by any man who passed her. She let herself be ignored, then noticed, then set to a chore she had chosen by the way she stood. From the back of the kitchens, where steam slicked the skins of women who had fed Stark and Traitor both, she could see the yard where a lord might take his destruction out on a dumb animal or a dumb boy. Winterfell wore the touch of new men badly, like a shirt put on wrong after a night with a skin of wine. She watched the wrongness move and noted how it snagged on the right places. A kennel master had survived. A pot boy had learned to stop humming the old songs until the old songs learned to hum under their breath through him. The wrong banners flapped and tired quickly. The right ones slept folded in meat smell, waiting. She slept 3 nights in the warm of the kitchen's end and earned the space with a skillful hand on a roasting spit. The 4th night, she went to the godswood. No one but the gods saw her pass under the oaken gate, and only they felt the drafted hush that lived under the needled arms. Snow lay like worn linen across root and stone. The heart tree was older than her fear, and younger than the first word she had said as a child. Its face looked like a secret a brother shares, and then wishes he could take back before anyone else hears. She knelt. She did not pretend that kneeling was obedience. Kneeling was posture and leverage. Sometimes it prepared you to spring. She put the reed of the kindly man's bowl into her mind and laid it on the black surface of the pool. Here, the pool had no reed. It had leaves that had fallen last autumn and refused to rot properly, and bits of sky and her breath. She whispered the names she had kept. The old prayer for opening, and the older one for silence. She said her father's name and heard nothing break. She said her sister's name and felt a tightness in her throat that had not loosened in years, unknot by a finger she could not see. "I have come to set a chair," she told the red face. And though she had not meant to, she thought at it with the sharpness she reserved for men who liked to hear themselves too long. "I will pay what the god requires, but not what liars require. I will not dress a lie in a face and call it a sacrifice. I will cut where rot is and bind where bone shows, and men are afraid to look. If this is against you, send me away with a sound I can hear." The wind came, and it did not knock her down. The snow shook itself from the branches and arranged itself again. She felt the change not as thunder or omen. It was more like standing and realizing that your foot has been touching the edge of a stair all along and would not slip now, no matter how the light changed. The many-faced god traveled well. The old gods did not spit him out. She did not weep. That was not because she was brave. It was because there was work, and tears did nothing but make salt on her skin when the air already had enough salt in it. On the way out of the godswood, a girl of perhaps 12 came in with a basket of kindling. She recognized the particular economy of the child's gait, the casual arithmetic of winter. The girl looked at Arya and did not see her. Arya wanted to place her hand on the girl's head and whisper promises. She did not. A promise is a brick. Too many break a back. She found a place between kitchens and kennel and made herself a tool. No one noticed until they needed her. She shortened a dyer's day by half with a better knot and set a scullion free of a wine merchant's demands by speaking 3 words in a voice all low-born learned to obey. She was the old seamstress in the yard when she wanted to be. She was the young boy who cleaned boots when that gained her the measure of a heel and the stamp of a cobbler who would sell his mother for a good piece of leather. She collected lives the way a winter fox collects roots, and she did not hurry. She wrote letters. She learned early that men stand straighter under the weight of a seal. The trick was a seal that stated nothing loudly and said everything quietly. She took wax from a lord's desk and pressed it with a wolf that had not been used since the spring a mason died. She wrote to a Manderley cousin in a hand that had once been a woman in Bravos, who had written debts down until debt and the shape of her letters were indistinguishable. She wrote to an Umber squire in a hand that knew how to sneak jokes into sober script without losing its balance. She wrote little. She suggested much. She never called herself. The Queenmaker's coin rolled without a face. People stamped it in their minds with their own pride. The North listened slowly when it was right to listen slowly. Arya found that she had room to move people by moving what they thought they had decided alone. She began to crouch in the rafters when men spoke in the yard and learned the subtle mathematics of insult and answer. She learned more of winter than she had in childhood. Winter had never been the same twice. On a morning that started gray and kept its promise, a rider came with a taped packet whose wax had more courage than its sender. The letter that spilled out stank of haste. It said a name she had not allowed herself to say aloud for too long. Sansa ... The letter wanted to be private. It had been taken off a boy near Barrowton, whose boots had not done the job, and whose feet had been taken in return. The captain of a house guard who was used to skimming what came across his desk had not known what the letter was until the way it bit his palm when he touched it. He had not opened it. He had brought it to the steward with the same face men bring to the executioner when they intend to strike him first. Arya had a face that made men hand her what they did not mean to cede. She read the letter, and the ink lifted from the page into the air between her and the hearth. And she remembered her sister's inclination to make even her fear neat. Sansa was south. No. East, no. Among the mountains where eagles drew circles on the sky as if they were bored by gravity. Sansa had learned to sign like someone else. Sansa wrote in cleanliness, even when the world dirtied its own hands. She would be a good queen for the North, because she had never belonged among men who thought the world was a board, made for their pieces alone. The letter did not ask for help. It wrote about weather. It wrote about stores of grain and the men who had promised more than they had. It wrote about a bastard boy given the task of teaching sums to children who were better at them than he was. It wrote about a widow. It did not mention the name of the man who had taught Sansa to shape silence into a wall. It did not need to. Arya burned the letter and brushed the ash into the corner where Ash slept. She went to the godswood and did not kneel. Only stood because sometimes respect needed to look the gods in the face. And she said aloud, "We set a chair." She began with small furniture. A Bolton man who fancied that he had wit enough for two men made a joke at dusk and laughed too loud. In his second skin, she laughed with him. In her first skin, she listened to the way other men measured his laugh and found it wanting. By the time he made a different joke the next week, he told it to fewer friends. She made a rumor of him that could not survive the cold. He was sent west, where the snow had made long roads into short traps. He did not return. She had not touched him. She had touched the air around him. A steward with long memory of Stark sins made lists in a careful hand and made sure those lists found their way under the eye of a man who had once pocketed coin. The steward's list sprouted a new column labeled generosity. The man who pocketed coin found that the pocket did not satisfy as well when he noticed that his son had begun to walk like him and had already learned to tuck his hand in like an old thief. The man stopped taking. The steward kept his lists. Arya moved two men with no names across a ledger in her head and felt the balance move like a reed on still water. A dog barked at her and then decided not to. She took that as a benediction and fed the dog scrap and let him follow her one night when she needed eyes behind her back. The dog did not signal. He did not need to. His quiet became a line she could put her foot on when she crossed a yard that had once been a safe place and would be again. When she needed a face, she wore one that had never seen snow and measured how the cold bit it. She used that face to ask the wine merchant about a shipment that had gone missing and to apologize to the man who had first taken the shipment with a knife and then lost it in a ditch to men who were better at discipline. She found the wine by knowing the shape of a man who had not known shame in a long time and learned to taste it again when he saw a woman who looked like his mother tell him she was disappointed. It had been a long time since he had allowed the world to disappoint him. It felt like he would not know to call it mercy. Mercy was not a word. a man like that wanted. But he lived, and the wine found the kitchen, and a boy whose birthday had fallen in winter drank a cup he would remember later when his son asked him what the north tasted like. After 2 months in the bones of the castle, she went out with a peddler who had a trick shoulder and a better song than his voice could carry. The road took her to villages where the winter had fallen thick, and the women had learned to laugh with their mouths closed. She listened to complaint the way she listened to a blade's edge under a finger, counting burrs and plotting where to draw the stone. Names rose, men who had leaned wrong, men who had remembered the wrong oaths first and the right ones later. She carried those names back and set them on the table in her bones, like knives placed gently beside bread. And then she went east. The veil lifted out of the land like a secret a mountain tells itself. In different skin, under a different hair, she passed wagons whose wheels worried at ruts hardened by old thaw. She found the lift road where old stones had taught themselves patience. At the gates of the moon, she watched men who thought themselves stern play at being winter. She went in with the cooks. She had been every kind of woman now, except the kind that did not watch. She did not think she would ever learn that. The Erie's ice was honest, even in summer. The hall spoke too loudly. The snow made noise in the mind crisp. A chime struck and left to quiver out. Sansa was upstairs among tapestries that had learned to be overheard. A girl called Elaine had good posture. Elaine thanked people. Elaine could make a room feel warmer by standing in it. Arya had not known this would be true when they were children. She had not known what a world could do with a woman who made warmth look like duty and not like begging. She did not go to her sister. Not first. She went to the steward who liked figures and made mistakes on purpose to see if anyone would correct him. She corrected him once as an old man who had chewed more toothpicks than meat. She corrected him again as a girl who had not learned to bend her head in the right places. The steward was pleased for different reasons. People are kindest when they believe themselves fair. She let the veil give her its edges. She found where the old river of Tully blood had pooled, and where it was being siphoned by new hands. She found where men liked to be in debt, because it proved the world counted them. She found the new words people used for Littlefinger, because names are often the first battlement to rise into sight. She found the old words people used for the errands, and wondered whether the mountain felt insulted that men thought it needed defending with words at all. When she finally stood close enough to smell the soap on her sister's hands, she did not speak. She let a small stumble move her forward with a tray, and corrected it with neat apology. Sansa's gratitude cut her with a familiarity so sharp she could have wept. The woman her sister had become sat behind eyes that had learned the art of not fearing their own tears. Sansa would not break the way some queens break, falling too prettily to teach anyone a lesson. Sansa would not fall at all if Arya had her way. In the hall that night, a puppet show made the boys of the Vale laugh. The show had tunnels under it when you looked with the right eyes. Arya followed those tunnels to a troops tent, where a man with a harelip kept a ledger he thought no one could read but him. She read it anyway, and she proposed to him a new story to carry across the Vale, and then north, and then across the Trident, to men who needed help coming to conclusions. The man with the harelip did not like being told what to act. He liked being paid. She made him look like a genius to his wife by suggesting a moral he thought he had invented. Men who have not been given enough credit in their lives are easy to move if you teach them to see their own reflection in the glass before you turn it into a mirror for your queen. The story went like this: a queen does not ask for her chair. The chair is made around her by men who discover they would sit better themselves if she sat first. A puppet fox stole a puppet chicken and found himself fed by a larger fox who understood the arithmetic of mercy. The boys laughed, as boys do when violence is implied but not shown. And the men who were boys a moment ago laughed too, and then felt clever for seeing the riddle in it. When they went home, they said her name without knowing they were saying it. Arya took a long walk after that, and let the wind beat the veils cold into her cheeks. She took a face that could age 10 years in an hour if someone put a hand on it the wrong way. She let a boy at arms flirt with her and responded with a sharp glance and a promise of nothing. And in that sharp glance, she put what an old septa would call a lesson and a mercenary would call a debt. Men remembered being refused more vividly than being granted. She did not need their violence. She needed their clarities. By then, Certain sums had begun to balance in Winterfell. She felt it in the letters that came not as names but as weather, inked by men who wanted to ask and did not know what to ask for. She felt it in the way the snows pressed down and the roofs did not break. She felt it in the way the old songs dared to return as a hum in the sculleries where women had begun to unlearn the fear of their own voices. She permitted herself an evening in which she ate soup and did not plan anything except the act of swallowing. It tasted like leeks, patience, and skin healed over an almost injury. She woke to the softest of alarms, the knowledge that something had taken a step where it had not a right to be. It was not a man. It was a rumor wearing a man's boots. She traced it to a knight who had learned to be greedy with other men's sons and generous with other men's daughters. His greed was clever. It was not the kind you could cut off at the wrist and call it done. He distributed small debts like a priest giving blessings he expected to be paid for in spring. He liked Sansa's quiet. No. He liked the story he told himself about being the first to see the queen in a woman everyone else called a ward. That story would curdle into something useless if it went on. He needed to be taught how to tell a different story about himself. Arya had learned long ago that the most dangerous men are those whose tales about their own honor have not been challenged in a decade. She did not wear a man's face to teach him. She wore a woman who had scrubbed floors so hard she had memorized the language of stone. She spoke to him as if he were her son. She did not scold him. She asked him to help her carry something. Men tremble in the presence of the work their mothers did, whether they admit it or not. In the kitchen, she dropped a pot into his hands that weighed more than his sword. He bore it with a laugh that had to be true because lies cannot hold iron. She told him to put it where it belonged. She watched him choose the right hook. He was a man who could be taught where things belonged. She would put his loyalty there. Later, she took his horse's bridle and loosened a strap by a hole and then tied it again. When he mounted, the leather sang at him, "Wrong, wrong, wrong," and he stopped and got down and looked at it. His hands remembered his father teaching him how to treat a beast right. He adjusted what had been adjusted and thought about fathers and sons. That night, he stood between Sansa and a man who would have stood too close if no one had been there to make the choice for him. The knight thought he was acting on his own. He was. She had only helped him hear the tune the world had been humming to him since he was a boy. When she finally spoke to Sansa, it was in a stairwell that was too narrow to hold much grief. The torch smoked like a soldier's last joke. Sansa's eyes found hers in a face that was no face she had worn in Winterfell, or the Vale, or Bravos, and yet there it was, the recognition that is older than words. Arya said only, "We need a chair with arms wide enough to keep the North's elbows off the table." Sansa's mouth tightened and then softened again, as if the ache of a healed scar had reminded her of what hurt had taught her to carry. "We will build it where it cannot be burned," she said. She did not ask how. She did not ask who would die. Her voice held the honor of someone who had seen too much to lie to herself, and the mercy of someone who might still forgive the world for doing what it is. "Winterfell is awake," Arya said. "Then so am I," Sansa answered. Arya left with her breath steady, and her bones warmed by a fire that had not required wood. She took the path that would look to others like she was running away. The Queenmaker always leaves a room looking like smoke, not like a hand on a latch. She slipped into the mad geometry of the Vale's roads and made for the high pass where the air had no softness in it. The first name she took in the god's name was a small one. A man who had been paid to miscount harvests so that his masters could be angry at their people and feel justified when they took the grain from their mouths. He had the eyes of someone who had not been told no in many years, not because of power but because no one had loved him enough to bruise his pride with the truth. She borrowed the face of his dead mother for a heartbeat, and then returned to him as a stranger who needed his help to lift a sack. He lifted it wrong, and his back twinged, and Arya set her palm to his spine in a way that made him remember a winter he had survived with a cousin who had coughed herself quiet. He knew then, without understanding, that he was not the kind of man he had told himself he was. The god took him in his sleep a week later, gently, without spectacle. Arya paid the temple a tithe in onions at the next village. She paid the widow from the miscounted harvest in gossip that steered her eldest boy away from a man who had looked at him with the wrong hunger. The scales moved. The reed held. She took a second name from a mouth that had spoken it too proudly in front of a boy carrying a water skin. The man with the name used to be known for clean hands. Now he was known for being lucky with dice. He should have known better than to throw. Luck is an insult you pay to other people's prudence. She made sure his dice betrayed him in front of the man he truly wanted to please. He lost his place and found a smaller one where his harm could not widen. He lived. The god accepted partial payments. Not all names could be taught to pay without the blade. There was a captain in a keep east of Widow's Watch whose favorite pastime was arranging small accidents that made big men look small and small girls smaller. He liked to watch the face change when people realized they would be spoken over and then praised if they did not complain. Arya learned the patterns of his stride. She learned the pattern of his appetite. She learned the distance between his eyes when he aimed and the distance between his lies when he explained. She borrowed a face with a scar he would pity, and she listened to him talk for an hour without saying anything herself. And in the space of that hour, she learned where the world would not miss him. She left his name at a tree by a stream and said the words that set the dead into motion. A week later, a horse that should have kept its footing in a sheen of frost did not. There are ways to put frost where frost will look innocent. It was a quiet death and a fair one. He had written his balance in a script even he could have read if he had wanted to. In White Harbor, a baker sang a song that had come up from the Vale. He did not know where he had learned it. He had not heard it in a puppet show. He had heard it in the way his wife set a table. He had heard it in the way a girl counted coins too carefully for a child. He put the song into the bread, and men who ate it thought better of themselves 3 times that day and made choices that made the North sound more like itself. There was still war, of course. There were men who would not be taught. There were knives. But knives are only loud because they are the last line in the stanza. Before them come measures made of steps, glances, half-decisions pulled through to their end by a patient hand. When Arya returned to Winterfell the next season, the banners had not changed. Not all of them. A few did not fly as high. A few flew at the wrong angle, which is a rot that only people who live under them can smell. She watched a man who had sworn himself 3 times remember which oath had tasted true in his mouth and which had stuck to his teeth like cheap tallow. She watched a boy write a letter and then tear it up because he had decided to say a thing to a person's face instead. She watched a woman sit down in a place where no one thought to offer her that chair, and then watched 3 men remove their hats without discussing it, because manners, like loyalties, are often the first thing to thaw. At dusk, she climbed the old broken tower. The stone knew her. She set her palm where it had been when she was a child, learning that some heights are kind. The yard below held the slow choreography of work. The smoke wrote its versions of prayer into the sky. Beyond the walls, the land's ribs showed where hunger had run hard. Beyond that, the river moved like old mercy. A step behind her. She did not turn. She had already measured and weighed. Sansa stood beside her and looked where she looked, not where she wanted her sister to see. That, too, was queenly. There will be a day when the men with wrong banners lift them because they think they have won, Sansa said. There will be a day after. There will be a day when all the banners rest, Arya said. Perhaps only for a day, but it will be enough to set the chair without blood on the wood. Then it turned to one. Sansa's laugh was the laugh of a woman who had unlearned the habit of making herself small. You speak like an old woman sometimes. I feel like a very old girl, Arya said. Stay, Sansa said. Or go. I know you will do the right one. I will go so I can stay, Arya said. They stood together without looking at one another and watched the color leave the day and the first stars take up their posts like loyal guards. When Arya went down the tower, she went in her true face. A boy by the well saw her and looked away because some faces tell you to respect the wish not to be seen. A dog lifted its head and sighed and moved only enough to make room for her foot. The kitchen's hum wrote itself into her bones again. That night, she slept and dreamed of a coin that had no face and rang true anyway. In the candlelight before dawn, when cooks start to clatter bowls and argue with spoons, She fashioned a seal from the wax of last night's meat pie and set it with a careful pressure. The letter was short, almost nothing. It spelled weather correctly and left room for men to read themselves into it. It went to a place on the Trident where lords believed they were the river. It asked no favors. It pointed to a logjam in the mind and suggested a place to cut. She held the letter above the candle flame until the wax reddened like a patient blush. She blew, and it hardened. The seal looked like a wolf's head if you tilted it and let your eyes go soft. It looked like a river stone otherwise. She preferred the stone. The courier was a woman whose feet said she had learned to run on paths that knew her and would not trip her, even when she forgot to look where she was going. Arya put the letter into her pouch and told her how to avoid men who wished to make conversation. She did not tell her which men those were. The woman would know. There was a lull, then, as if the world had paused for breath before the next line of the verse. In that pause, Arya took a piece of barley bread and ate it standing up at the door to the yard. Snow ticked the air in small, polite requests. Someone laughed off to her right. The laugh had a question in it. She answered the question later, in a different face, with a reminder that the man who laughed had once been taught by his grandmother to sit up straight when a lady entered the room. He would sit straighter now when a queen did, though she would not always be wearing a crown. It would be longer work than a season. It would be work that did not end with a battle. The god would call in strange markers, and she would have to decide whether to accept their fairness. There would be moments when her reed sank. She would take it out and lay it back again, and learn. Slowly. What weight she could remove, and what she could not. There would be a day when the banners changed. There would be a day after that, when she lay on the floor of the godswood with her cheek on the cold, and felt old and young at once, and told the red maple face that the chair was set, and it had held, and the woman in it had learned how to be heavier than steel, without ever raising her voice. But the morning after barley bread at the door, there was only a road. Roads are the North's way of understanding timelines. She took one in a pace she had learned from older men who did not hurry because distance hurries you, whether you ask it to or not. She carried two faces in a pouch, and her own in her bones, and 1,000 small balances under her tongue like seeds. When she reached the mile where the wind turns and speaks in a different grammar, she stopped and said to the air, "We keep our coins on a string across the heart." A raven ruffled on a branch as if it knew profanity in all tongues. She smiled. Far off, someone struck iron. Someone else lit a candle for a god whose face they did not imagine, because imagining was more dangerous than the dark. Arya Stark did not pray then. She measured. She measured the day. She measured her own steadiness. She measured the chair that still needed sanding on its left arm. She measured the men who would put their weight on it, and the women who would carry it when winter demanded chairs be moved. Between measure and mercy, there is work. She went to it. The snow made a new map that would be gone by noon. She walked it anyway, because what you learn from a vanishing map is how to carry the world without needing it to write itself down for you every time. The road north unrolled itself before her like a spool of old cloth, serviceable and threadbare in places where summer feet had made careless use of it. She put her weight where the earth remembered kindness and spared herself from the hidden ice that lay with the patience of old grudges. A man with a lute passed her and sang of a smith who had fallen in love with his own anvil. She answered with a coin and no question. Men who make songs are messengers who don't know which letters they carry. It is best to let them learn the meaning in their own mouths, or not at all. Past the barrows, the wind organized itself into ropes and tugged. She leaned into it. A flock of small black birds moved in a single mind across the sky, and then broke apart when a hawk rode itself briefly into the afternoon. She counted the bird shapes because counting kept the river inside her calm. In Bravos, numbers had been a sacrament. In the north, they were a language you spoke to wood and snow, and got honest answers back. She stopped in a hamlet where a woman was boiling leather for soup. The woman had the stubbornness that keeps people alive in bad stories, and a scar along her jaw that told a better story about a night with a drunk than any priest ever had. Arya helped her skim the pot. There are ways to lift the scum so it does not thicken. and in exchange asked where the last tax rider had slept. The woman spat without taking her eyes off the pot and tilted her head toward a shed that had once been for lambing. That was as good as a name. The man who had collected the king's due when the king's hand was far away wore his sword like a man who had begun to forget that swords were tools. He would live longer than the men who wore theirs like badges, but not as long as the ones who wore them like hands. She poured him a cup of cider with too much winter in it and listened to him talk about the problem of people insisting their children eat. It made them poor, he said, while gnawing on a piece of hard bread he had not paid for. She did not argue. She gave him a face that reminded him of his aunt, not the one who had beaten him, but the one who had wrapped his feet in rags the winter he nearly lost his toes. When men remember tenderness without being told to, they often behave as if they had invented mercy. He reduced his sum by 1/10 for 3 villages. She watched him do the arithmetic as if it were his idea. Later, she wrote a letter to the steward, whose lists had columns for everything except shame. She added a new column for his eyes only. Save. He would like how it felt. He would repeat it. On she went, taking small edges off large hungers. The north did not bend quickly. It is not a river so much as a field that remembers every footprint and decides which ones to keep. She left a peddler with a sack of needles where there had been none and took from him a song he did not know he was carrying. A tale about a wolf who never raised her voice and made even the trees listen. When he sang it in the next village, a boy sitting by the door sat a little straighter and, without understanding why, stopped lying to his mother about where he went after dusk. When she reached a place where the road gave itself to White Harbor's broad streets, she paused and let the city's breath wash her. Salt, fish, ink, wool, iron filings, stale beer, a sweet pepper. Someone had pried from a trader's cart. After a roll of dice, White Harbor wore good manners like an old cloak, mended, clean and proud of being clean. Manderley men had bellies and brains. Their women had spines like ship keels. She knew the signs. She presented herself in a fishmonger's apron and bought more than she needed because generosity made the fishmonger talk. And talk showed her the way to the counting room behind a baker's shop, where a cousin twice removed from a lord's cousin weighed gold with a hand steady from habit, not honor. She did not ask to see any lord. Lords are theaters, you dress them last. She asked to see a ledger with an error that had been allowed to live too long. She found 3 and fixed 2. The third she left, and left it in such a way that the man who wore his belly like armor would find it himself and be pleased to have the excuse to do what he already wanted. Feed fleets and keep them paid to sail for wolves when that time came. He would think he had been prudent. He would be right. She did not need him to know he had been moved. At a dockside tavern where the smoke gathered like a parliament under the rafters, she sat near a man who knew the tides by the ache in his knees. He had a daughter whose name belonged on a boat. He did not know that yet. Arya put that knowledge into him with 2 questions and a story about a different harbor where a girl had learned to tie a bowline faster than her father. The man would sell that name to his daughter the next morning with such conviction that the girl would believe the idea had been born in her. When a house needed boats, someone with that name would bring them upriver without being begged. A queen sits more firmly if the river likes her. She spent a week with the Manderleys without ever seeing a man in blue velvet. She saw instead the seam that joined city to river and made sure it was oiled. When she left, she carried with her a taste of sweet rolls and a note written by a clerk with the careful pride of a man who had practiced his handwriting on bad paper and was now allowed to write on good. The note did not promise fealty. It promised flower. Flower is a pledge with a better memory than men. Eastward again and northward, then west, then a detour where the road insisted. At the last river, she found men fishing through a hole in the ice with patience identical to prayer. She learned their names and the names of the boys they had buried when the ice had been untrustworthy 2 winters past. She learned which banners made a man's mouth tighten, and which made his shoulders drop. She respected their grief. She did not buy it. Grief is a coin too many men try to spend in the wrong market. At last hearth, the gate creaked like an old man's joke. Crows had scribbled poems on the lintels. Moore's umber, called crow food, had a laugh like an axe-splitting seasoned pine. He was older than most men permitted themselves to be. He measured her without moving his head. She did not wear a girl's face to meet him. She wore a widow whose eyes had memorized distances in deep snow. He listened better to women who had won fights simply by outlasting them. "What business does winter have with a stranger?" he asked. There was friendliness in it, the kind that tests before it warms. "Furniture," she said. He looked at her mouth and her hands and decided to take the word seriously. "Wood's scarce enough," he said. "Not when men remember which trees are theirs," she said. He grunted. "There's a tree with faces at Winterfell wants talking to," he said, as if he were admitting to an affection he did not enjoy admitting to. "I went once, and it looked back." "It does that," she said. "I asked it for a chair that would not break." He spat into the snow and wiped his glove on his breeches. He said, not agreeing and not disagreeing, but confessing he had already cut a plank for such a chair and wanted to see if it would fit. He sent her away with 3 small things that were larger than they looked. A name he had not spoken in front of his men, a girl who could run faster than a lie, and a string of sausage he pretended to be angry about losing. Across the snowfields where the wind wrote and erased and wrote again, she moved like someone who had been told the tune of the land when she was small and had never forgotten it. Wildlings had come through long before, and some had stayed. She did not go into their tents. She nodded to a woman whose hair was the color of old straw and whose eyes knew how to count the living. The woman nodded back and did not smile. That was greeting enough. The North had begun to remember itself in odd corners. It would be a long remembering. She found a Karstark man with a pious mouth and the wrong friends. The Karstarks had family that still thought treachery was a shortcut through a wood where no one had ever cut a path. This man liked to tell stories about loyalty while measuring profits with his thumb heavier than his eyes. She wore a face he would trust, a man too careful to be cursed, the sort who avoided the phrase just this once because he had learned what such words cost. She listened to the Karstark long enough to know where he hid his fear. Men who talk of honor are often afraid of going hungry. She arranged for him to be full under the wrong banner and hungry under the right. Hunger taught him better. In 2 months, he would step aside and let his niece write the letters he had botched. The girl's hand would be neat, and her letters would arrive in Winterfell at the right time, and bread would be unspoiled by the time it reached the table. That's a law older than oaths. Timing is the difference between starve and sup. In a watchtower abandoned by garrisons who had learned to count only southern orders, she met 3 men from the mountain clans. They stood like trees forced to grow at angles by wind. She told them a story that belonged to their grandfathers, because a Braavosi counting house teaches you how to hear what numbers the dead still whisper. She reminded them of a night when the sky had put on lights and their fathers had decided to move the camp because the wind had changed smell. She knew the detail because one of those men had told his son the tale 10 times, and the son had told it badly to a girl at a fair, and Arya had heard it and fixed it in her mind and waited until it would do work. When she finished, the men were satisfied, not because the tale was good, but because the world had fit them again for a time. "The wolf," one of them said. "The word, a breath and a blade. The chair," she said. They agreed without admitting to it and took her to the edge of a ravine where a path went down with the stubbornness of a command. She refused the path and took instead the ridge. And when they saw her pick the right rocks and the right snow and the right order of steps, their admiration was a winter thing. Low fire, long-lasting. Letters traveled behind her, ahead of her, beside her, like dogs that had learned how to stay at heel. She wrote them from stalls, from the back of carts, with ink so watered it took a patient fire to bring it out of the paper. Some carried no words at all, only a seal whose shape meant more than it said. Some carried only a piece of a sentence that would find its other half a county away. One letter bore 3 words and a point of raw wool. A woman in Torrens Square knew what to do with that wool, and by nightfall had told her husband they could keep the pigs, and no one would argue because someone higher had already decided the grain for which the pigs would have been sold was safer where it had been. 3 days later, a handful of boys got bread early, and did not have to carry loads that would have bent their backs the way their fathers had bent. Those boys would stand straight for the rest of their days and call that honor. It would be, and it would also be arithmetic. When she went back to the Vale, winter was a different color. The sky above the jagged places had a paler, thinner blue, like the last thread in a worn sleeve. Snow whispered in stairwells and turned the eyrie into a piece of music a man could freeze to if he stopped moving. She wore a face that made people believe she had always belonged to cold places. She moved with a careful grace that made her unremarkable in halls where people watched for a different kind of danger. Sansa had grown quieter where other women would have grown louder. That was wisdom or wound. It is difficult to tell the difference while the skin is still knitting. She listened to men argue about coin, and men argue about cousins, and men argue about whether snow should be moved with shovels or sticks. She learned the sentences men used when they had decided and were pretending to consider. She learned the faces they made when someone had said something that made sense. She learned, too, how to ignore the men who had decided to build their worth on being ignored. That was a power Arya had not known her sister could wield. It pleased her. A queen who can make space with silence makes better laws. The knight with the bridle learned to say no to himself when he wanted to say yes to attention. She watched him in a corridor where the drafts never arrived on time. He stared at the floor, and then at a tapestry of hawks, and then at his hands. He made his decision. Later that day he spoke in a council, and did not say the thing he had told himself 100 times he would say. He said instead what needed saying. The men heard him and felt relief. He had become a hinge. Doors move quietly when the hinges are right. Jan Royce had the beard of a man who had forgotten he owned a face. His voice was a long road, steady, predictable, ending in a camp that would not collapse if the wind came up. He measured the room with old eyes and did not like what he saw. He liked the girl called Elaine because she told him the truth once, when she could have told him something prettier. He did not know that truth had a ghost standing beside it. He did not need to. Arya watched him agree to something in his bones long before he signed it with his hand. Old men join revolutions not because they want to, but because the world has asked them 3 times, and the 3rd time sounds like their father. The puppet show returned, with better jokes about foxes and a new moral about geese that think themselves moral about geese that think themselves swans. Boys laughed. Men laughed. The laughter had a different shape now, the shape of men who had begun to enjoy being led somewhere they had intended to go anyway. Arya tipped the Harelip man double and corrected a line under her breath so that the puppet's paws landed where it would do the most good. A pause is the sharpest knife in a play. When she moved south of the mountains into the riverlands, fire had laid itself down in great black prayers across fields that would remember for a generation. Frey men strutted in places where strutting should have looked ridiculous. It did not, yet. She made it look so. At a crossroads inn where the bread tasted of ash and the ale had learned to apologize in the cup. She sat under an antlered rack and listened to a Frey boy spin stories to impress a whore who deserved better. He bragged about bridges and guessed right, and a jest played on a baker whose crust had not risen since. He had the kind of mouth that makes a woman look at her daughter and decide to keep her home when the fair comes. Arya let him talk. The girl he wanted to impress rolled her eyes and decided not to charge him double. Arya asked him about dice and let him win twice. The 3rd time took his coin and left him with a sudden understanding of hunger. She put into his ear, careless as a rumor, the tale of a lord of the city by the sea who had once made pies out of small men with big names. He laughed at the wrong place in the story. That was the kind of mistake that killed. She arranged for him to be in a different town when the man he owed money to came calling with a cudgel. He would learn to be a small man with a small name, and be happier for it. Others bearing that cursed Bridges name would not be so lucky. She wrote a letter to a Blackwood cousin and included only a feather from a crow that had molted late. The cousin would understand. He would send wood when asked. He would also sharpen the words he used to describe keeping oaths. And the men who heard those words would feel their chests rise with pride. They had forgotten it was allowable to feel. A queen's chair requires wood from trees that like the person who sits in it. Winter came around again, then softened into a mean spring, then remembered it was not finished, and came back for one night, only to remind the north who ruled. Arya moved through the seasons with a patience she had not possessed as a child. Back then she had wanted names struck quick off a list. Death is the smallest kind of justice. Now she wanted the arithmetic to line in such a way that the reckoning would balance without putting too many mothers into black. She used knives when knives were the exact word the god demanded. She used glances and absences and accounting when those were the better prayers. In a village near Deepwood Moat, where trees kneel in wind because they learned to, she found a girl standing with an axe in her hand, as if the handle grew out of her wrist. The girl's mouth had been taught to be sharp and her eyes to be sharper. "The men are fools," the girl said, without preamble and without shame. "Often," Arya said, just as flat. "They want to wait," the girl said, as if waiting is not a decision. "What do you do when you wait?" Arya asked. "I count," the girl said, puzzled to hear her own truth aloud. "Good," Arya said. "Count how many you have. Count how many you need. Count how many will come when a letter arrives signed by a wolf's hand. Count and ask your mother for the table. She will not bring out unless someone important is coming to supper." "Dan? Who is coming?" the girl asked. "You are," Arya said. The girl did not smile. A better sign than smiling would have been. A week later, 3 men with axes stood a little behind the girl and did not look at one another when she spoke in a hall that smelled of old fish. Someone laughed in the wrong place and felt foolish when he realized that the laugh had not been earned. He would put his laughter in better places after that. In a keep built more for show than hard use. A steward with a worm of greed in him that he had disguised as thrift punished a boy by docking his bread for forgetting to bow to a man he should not have had to bow to. Arya found the steward's wife and complimented the pattern she had sewn on the cuffs of her husband's shirt. No one had done that in years. The wife looked at her hands and saw, suddenly, that they had made something finer than the man who wore it. She fed the boy herself that evening and told her husband she would not wash that shirt again until he had apologized to the boy in front of the men. He did. He later told himself he had done it because he was a just man. Men told themselves many things. The god accepted those stories if the behavior followed. Arya sent ravens to places where ravens remembered her scent. She sent them with strings tied in certain knots. Knots say things when men do not wish to commit their throats to those words. In Maidenpool, a knot meant debt paid in full. In White Harbor, it meant more flour than promised. In the Rills, it meant a man had run and would not be pursued if he turned back before moonrise. She used the wrong knots on purpose in 2 places, so that the right men would be infuriated and do what she had wanted them to do quickly, just to show her how it should be done. Pride is a sharp horse. Sometimes you let it pull. She met a man from House Glover on a road cut through soggy fields and watched the light leave his eyes when he spoke of oaths that had been broken and the shame of living with them. "Shame is a good winter," she said. "It kills what should not live and leaves the ground ready for better seed." He stared at her and then, slowly, agreed without having to say so. He went home and scolded his own heart and then his men's, and when a raven came asking for wood and warriors, he did not count the cost as long as he would have before. She did not kill often. When she did, it was not the red kind that writes itself into songs. It was the soft kind that prefers ledgers. A man whose habit was to sell news to both sides ceased to wake. A rider who liked to take girls onto his saddle and tell them that the world owed him that kind of pleasure, broke his leg in a place that would make him limp forever and change his mind about what men are owed. A woman who had taught herself to love the sound of coin more than the sound of her child's breath was given a silver accident that disabused her of that religion. The god was in these things not as a shout, but as the water under ice. Moving, undeniable. She wrote Sansa seldom. The letters said nothing and everything. "The nights are short," she wrote once, and Sansa answered, "I light a candle slower and it burns longer. The bread rose even with old yeast," she wrote another time, and Sansa replied, "I kept the oven closed." The language of sisters is older than enemy ears. When at last there was news that would not be kept under, it arrived like thunder from two horizons at once. Men in the Dreadfort's service had begun to be seen with eyes that never looked at one another. Hunters brought less meat and more malice. The banners that did not belong above Winterfell blew a little weaker on a day without wind. That is a small miracle, even men who do not like miracles notice. In the Vale, a hawk screamed and would not stop until the knuckles of the man who held its jesses bled. Sansa looked up from a book she was pretending to read and set it aside. "It is time," she said to the room, which did not understand what she meant and soon would. Men from the mountain clans came down roads they had not liked for generations. Men from the Fingers came with their boats, and, to their surprise, found they did not drown in snow. A boy from the Green Fork of the Trident arrived with a letter in his boot that smelled of onions and truth. Wyman Manderley's cousin wrote to say that the ovens were ready for more than bread. He did not say what else would be warmed, because men who have lost sons are entitled to their own words. Arya went to Winterfell first as a girl carrying needles. She mended a banner with a stitch that would hold until someone cut it with a knife. She walked by the mews and let a hawk's eye look through her to something she had not known she still had. In the yard, the wrong men practiced riding and forgot to watch the walls. In the kitchens, the right women portioned the flour as if they had heard it would need to stretch and had decided not to let it. She laid a coin on the hearthstone and turned it with her thumb until it chose a face. It chose a wolf and then a stone. Both were acceptable. She said a meeting in the Godswood because men who lie there are easier to read. They do not like the tree's faces. 3 men who had sworn one oath and kept another came and stood like boys in an old lesson. She did not preach. She asked what they remembered before the snow made everyone miserable. They told her of tournaments and feasts and songs and collars and tax riders who did not smell like pig fat. She let them speak themselves into the men they wished to be, and then gave them each a job. One would forget to post a guard where a door opened onto a lesser yard. One would lose a key that did not fit any lock he owned. One would be seen with a man he ought not have been seen with. None of these were crimes in themselves. Added together, they made a path. Sansa came under a hood in a cart filled with straw that smelled honest and hid nothing worse than a mouse. The woman who drove it had shoulders built from lifting sacks, and a contempt for men who shouted when a quiet word would do. When they rolled under the gate, the woman spat the way Crowfoot had spat, and said she didn't have time for fools. The guard stepped back because men step back when a woman who is not afraid of them looks them in the eye during late afternoon in a snow that bites. The hood did not come off. It did not need to. Winterfell recognized its own even when the face was covered, and the breath came small and careful. They did not crown her. Crowns are noisy. They made a chair. They brought it in pieces and assembled it in the hall with the calm of people who are simply putting furniture where furniture belongs. A steward asked what it was. "A place to sit," a woman said, and sat in it, and then stood at once because she knew she had not earned it. Sansa came in as if she were looking for a plate she'd set down somewhere. She did not go to the chair. She went to the kitchen door and asked if they needed help carrying the cauldrons. Cooks have long memories. The chief cook said no and felt tears, which she swallowed as if they were salt and she hadn't time for sweetness. Sansa crossed the hall without hurrying. Men stood because their fathers had taught them to. She stopped near the chair and asked a man to tell her whether he preferred the old songs at night or in the morning. He answered without thinking, and then looked at the chair and realized he had been answered too. The wrong banners did not fall. Not then. Men whose job it was to see such things pretended not to see them. They made jokes about chairs. Arya let them. Jokes often precede oaths. She stood beside a pillar and did nothing. Doing nothing is a skill. Through not moving, she made a path for those who needed to find themselves careful for the first time in years. Bolton men began to quarrel among themselves with a sophistication that would have made her laugh if it had not been so useful. She had given one of their captains an opportunity to risk his pride in front of a boy he admired. He had taken it and felt his pride improve. The way iron improves with tempered flame. He made different choices after. Another captain found that the horse he loved best loved someone else more. Loves are levers. Arya applied the weight of a hand where she had to. She let gravity do the rest. The many-faced god does not like waste. She took a life in the night and blamed the ice. The man had deserved it long before she could spell the word deserve. His death did not shift a balance so much as free it to move. In the morning, the air tasted clean. She told the god's wood what she had done. The face on the tree looked like a father who had chosen not to be angry because anger would make a poor lesson. She thanked it for its patience and left an onion on a root. In the smaller hall off the grate, where servants took their bread and the noise made secrets safe, Arya listened to a boy teach an old man to count. The boy used pebbles, and he placed them in groups that made the hand want to close around them. "Like this," he said, and the old man grunted and made a gesture that meant pride, disguised as irritation. The boy lit up as if a candle had been set behind his eyes. There is a kind of governance even a queen cannot do unless such small lessons go right. Arya made sure the boy had boots. Letters went from Winterfell like heat, invisible, inevitable. Some went to Bear Island and received back a sentence that could fell trees. Some went to White Harbor and received back a snowflake, drawn in the corner of a letter that made no promises but thawed anyway. Some went to the mountain clans and returned as a rumor that the old songs had been heard, faint, under the new. In the Vale, Sansa's reputation improved among men. She would never meet, because men like to be on the right side of history before history chooses. Jan Royce found his boots on a morning when he had feared they would be taken. He laughed and did not tell anyone why. When the first company of Vale men rode under Winterfell's walls, they did not thunder or trumpet. They came in like weather that had always meant to get here. Their horses did not shy. Their men looked around with the frank appraisal of carpenters, asked to check another man's work. They did not stay long. They looked at the chair and looked at the woman who did not sit in it, and looked at the banners that did not belong, and then left with the casual arrogance of men who knew where the high ground lay, even when the land looked flat. In their wake, 3 men in Bolton colors asked for transfers to nowhere in particular. They were told no. They chose to sicken on a day when sickness would not be remarked. 2 died. 1 recovered and decided he preferred men who do not decorate people with flayed skin. He would never call it a moral decision. It would be. The god does not care what you call the weight you pay, so long as it balances. When spring came for a week and then changed its mind, Arya sat in the god's wood with her back to the heart tree and talked to it as if it were a brother who needed a push, but would resent it if she put her hands on his shoulders. There will be blood, she said. As one might say, there will be rain. I would like it to be blood the ground will accept. The face in the bark offered no counsel. Faces carved by men do not scold. They permit. She set her palm to the red mouth and felt the throb of root and water. Her own pulse slowed until it matched. When she stood, she was no wiser and more able to endure her lack of wisdom. The day the banners changed, it happened not at noon with trumpets, but in the long blue hour when the cooks were arguing about whether to salt before or after. Snow fell like flour shaken through a sieve. A man in the yard tripped on nothing and swore. Another man picked him up and said nothing, and did not let go right away. A boy drew a wolf in the frost with his finger and rubbed it out fast when he realized what he had done. Someone in the hall began a song and stopped because his voice had gone thin. Sansa walked in and did not look up. A woman set a bowl on a table as if setting an oath down. The wrong banner slipped because the rope had frayed. No one moved to fix it. A second slipped. A third did not have the strength to hold to its staff. The rope had frayed because ropes fray when men who once would have mended them no longer think it is worth the work. The rope had frayed because Arya had suggested to someone that winter is the time to save your fingers, not to worship your banners. When they fell, No one cheered. That came later. They fell with the sound of cloth changing its mind about what it is. A man went out to fetch them and fold them. He did not bring them back in. He took them away and set them on a pile that would not be burned yet. Fire must be fed in a certain order, or it grows greedy. There would be time for flames. There would be time for law. The chair took the weight it had been built to take. Sansa sat, not at once, not with triumph. She sat because the work required sitting. She placed her hands where they would not look like fists. Men looked and saw their own mothers behaving themselves, and felt the wildness in them smooth. She spoke as if she were speaking to a room that had once loved her, and was not sure it still did. She asked for bread to be sent to the yard, and for the dogs to be fed first, because dogs that smell hunger in a hall are worse than men who do. She asked for an inventory of needles and thread, then of arrows and oil, then of names. She did not demand. She assigned tasks. Men left the hall feeling more useful than they had when they entered. That is a kind of victory no bard sings well enough. A raven went south with news written so plainly even liars could not rearrange it without the ink accusing them. Another flew east to men whose ships were already being tarred. One went to a keep on a hill where a man who had once loved Sansa for his own reasons, and heard her for others, read the words, snorted, and told himself he had planned for exactly this. He had not. Plans D in the teeth of women who have learned to be quiet. Arya slept in the straw that night, and woke with her face damp where the hay had been cold and kind. She went to the kitchens and poured ale for men who had no right to call themselves hers, and yet were. She pressed a seal into wax with a thumb that would never be adorned with rings. She sat in the godswood and told the old face a story about a girl who had tried to become no one, and had instead become too many people to count, and had learned, in the end, to be exactly one. Trouble did not end. Men came with claims, with papers, with swords, with gods that did not like the faces in Winterfell's trees. They came with girls on their saddles, they called sisters, and men at their heels. They called friends. They came with memories they had adjusted to suit themselves. Arya sharpened the chair's corners and rounded its arms. She used letters like wedges and salves. She put men in rooms with other men they did not wish to agree with, and made them share bread before speaking. Guest right is a law older than kings. It still teaches. She went to Bravos when the snow turned to soup and men grew careless. The kindly man was there, and the reed still balanced on the bowl. Crooked and stubborn as grief. She told him the chair had been set. He nodded, as if she had told him the tide had come in. Coins ring truest when they remember whose fingers held them last, he said. A queen is a coin that must not be spent. She will spend herself, Arya said. She has learned how to be dear without being costly. Then you have done enough for a season, he said. Winter will ask for you again. I know, she said. She left 2 faces in the cellar and took one she had never worn, a plain one belonging to no one but herself. She wore it on the boat back and let the wind lift it, the way a mother lifts a child to see over a wall. It fit better than it had. She wondered if that would last. Back in Winterfell, the chair creaked when a man too heavy for his years sat in it. He laughed at the sound and then stopped, because the laugh sounded wrong in that hall. He apologized to the chair. People saw and made quiet decisions about him they would not change later. Sansa had a cold and spoke anyway. Her voice was lower and better for it. She called for the names of those who had not been fed. A boy stood up with a list he had kept in his head because no one had given him paper. She sent for paper. He would carry a satchel and put his name at the top of his own letters before the year was out. A Frey came with a claim and left with a lesson. He had expected to teach it. He discovered he had been the student. He talked in the yard about contracts and bridges, as if contracts were stones and bridges were gods. Arya asked him gently for the name of the boy who had carried his last important message. He did not know it. She turned to the men listening and said the boy's name. The men cheered, not for her, but because the sound of that name in a hall made the world fit their shoulders better. The Frey went away and told his kin that Winterfell had been rude. He believed it. He would learn ruder. There were nights when Arya lay awake and counted not boats or guards, but mercies. Mercy had been her knife once, and she had thought the word belonged to blades. Now she counted other shapes, a loaf cut fair when the last mouth had not been filled, a man corrected without humiliation, a girl given a room with a door that latched from inside, a steward remembered with a song on his name day. These mercies accumulated and made banners of their own. No wind could tear them down without tearing down the lives beneath. Once, in the yard, a boy pretending to be a lord and a girl, pretending to be a knight, collided and fell and looked up at her with the same astonished accusation. "Why did the ground not move aside?" "Because you asked nothing of it," she said. And they were offended, and then later, grateful. She watched them practice until their muscles learned the answer without their minds. War came again while the rivers were fat and angry. Men from the south with lion patches and eagle banners, and a few with a hand too golden for anyone's taste, came and asked the north what it meant to hold a line. The north told them. Sansa took counsel with men who liked the sound of their own counsel, and then did as she had intended. She sent wood where wood would break an enemy before it could burn. She sent food where food would keep boys from becoming men too soon. She sent a letter to a castle long lost, addressing it to the son of a man whose grave had never been found. A boy received it and felt his father's hand on his shoulder. He came north with 10 men who had thought themselves tired. He was exactly on time. Arya rode with the mountain clans for a week and learned again how to sleep on stone. She ate meat under the stars and did not name constellations because names can make people careless. She laughed once, short and real, because an old man told a joke about a bear that had slept through the wrong wedding and woken up a lord. She remembered being Arya, daughter of Eddard, who had laughed at the wrong places and been scolded by Septa Mordain. She felt the old ache and the old joy, and then put them away without pretending they were gone. In a village where the snow had finally chosen to leave, she watched a woman teach 3 children to string fish on willow splints. The woman's hands made a better music than the temple bells in Bravos. Arya knew then that the chair would hold, even if the woman never knew the queen's name. A nation is not a banner or a law. It is a habit of doing chores in a way that keeps your neighbor from starving while you save seed for next spring. Queens do not invent such habits. If they are wise, they fit themselves to them and teach men who have forgotten. At dusk in Summerhall, where ghosts prefer to be alive in men's mouths, a man tried to tell her a destiny. She left him with his drink and his prophecy, and a coin that would feel heavy to him in the morning. She walked out into air that smelled of old ash, thought of dragons without wanting any, and felt the steady beat of something better than destiny. The predictability of a woman who gets up, lights a fire, boils water, and writes a list. She returned to Winterfell in a face like her own and stopped in the doorway of the Great Hall to watch Sansa take a petition from a woman who had walked 3 days because her husband would not admit he had taken a neighbor's sheep. Sansa listened, corrected, and when the husband lied, she let him hear himself. He blushed the way men do when they suddenly remember their mothers. He returned the sheep. The woman slept that night with her door latched. Arya pressed her palm against the stone and felt it warmer than it had been. Stone is slower than men. It was learning. There would be other banners to take down. There would be banners to raise without making the roof look foolish. There would be a day when men with southern voices would come to negotiate and leave with less than they wanted, and more than they deserved. There would be laughter in the yard, on a day when the wind remembered summer. There would be a name cut from a list, and replaced with another not because the god demanded, but because Arya did. She would confess it later and be forgiven, or not. The reed would sink. She would take it out. She would try again. On a morning that let the sun through a fistful of clouds as if reluctantly, she went to the broken tower and climbed. The steps knew her. The air near the top had learned to curl around her and not bite. Below, boys ran. Dogs argued. Men carried beams. Women carried everything. Sansa came and stood beside her and did not speak. She tucked her hands into her sleeves, the way their mother had done on cold mornings at the table. Arya looked at her and saw, not the girl she had been, Not the lady she might have been in another story, but the thing beyond those, the oak that had learned to take the wind without losing branches, and had sent roots under the enemy's wall, while everyone was looking at leaves. "There are names," Sansa said at last. "I will not learn them all." "You don't need to," Arya said. "You need to let other people's mouths speak them, and make sure their voices don't crack." "I will fail," Sansa said, in the tone of someone who has allowed a truth to enter the room, "and sit down." "Sometimes," Arya said. "Not when it matters. Or not in the way that matters." They were silent together. Somewhere, someone dropped a pan and swore. Somewhere else, a raven decided the godswood was good enough. Arya's hands twitched, remembering swords and lists and faces. She stilled them. "I dreamed last night that the chair was a boat," Sansa said, as if confessing an interesting accident. "It floated when it should have sunk, and sank when I thought I wanted it to float. Then we will learn when to sit and when to stand," Arya said. "You'll go," Sansa said. It was not accusation. It was whether. "I'll go so I can come back," Arya said. She left by the postern gate at dawn when the kitchen girls argue heaviest, and the dogs sleep as if they trust the world. She carried a face she would wear once and put away, and a letter folded small, and a small wooden wolf that had been sanded by a man with big hands who did not know he had made religion. The road lay out like a vein. The wind was her old aunt, scolding and affectionate. She smiled and did not show her teeth. The chair behind her held. Ahead there were doors with poor latches, and men with good hearts, and women with tired knees, and banners that had not yet learned what kind of wind they had to face. The many-faced god traveled in her as simply as breath. The old gods stood like trees wherever water could get to their feet and honor to their mouths. She had wanted once to be no one so she could be justice. Now she was someone so other people could be. She cut where rot insisted and rapped where bone threatened to break skin. She balanced. She waited. She moved men with a hand, with a letter, with a bowl of soup brought without being asked. She made a queen not with a crown but with a chair in the notion, forced gently into the world, that sitting could be stronger than standing if the wood was right. On a ridge above a road where carts had carved ruts that remembered summers too long ago, she stopped to piss and laughed because sometimes the body insists on its own democracy, and the snow-minded gods and the coin-counting god are all pleased to see a woman squat without shame. A raven croaked. A boy on the road below ran like a message. She would catch up with him, or not. Messages know their own work. She had enough for the day. A name to pay, a rumor to bend, a heap of wood to make into something you could trust. The sun tried again. The wind forgave it. She walked.